Hi, in this video, I'm going to talk about the history of Peru and Colombia. So starting off with Peru, uh, after it became independent from Spain, the economy was a bit weak due to them being left on their own to run their own economy. So basically, 20 years later or so, uh, guano became the primary export that enriched Peru's economy. Guano is basically a fertilizer, and they were able to export a lot of it to Great Britain and other places in Europe. Um, and basically, these guano merchants, like they kind of suffered from mining guano due to the fact that the government kept a certain amount of the money they made. And eventually this led to an argument between like the guano merchants and the Peruvian government due to the fact that the Peruvian merchants wanted to sell a high quantity of guano at lower prices, yet the government wanted to do the exact opposite of selling guano at high prices but a lower volume, thereby having a higher profit margin. Um, and this, of course, like I said earlier, Peru relied on guano primarily throughout the 19th century. Now, Peru had a lot of immigration during the guano age, like Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants who came in and they helped mine some of that guano. And there was also some Spanish immigration as well. And the local people in Peru were mistreating those Spanish immigrants, which led to Spain retaliating against Peru by seizing some of their guano riches. And after the guano age ended and guano started to decline a little bit, Peru relied primarily on mining sugar and cotton from about 1890 to 1930. And then after those three products, they relied on copper to export, which became the biggest export by the mid 1970s. So it's like for a couple hundred years, Peru had export growth. Then Alberto Fujimori came in as the new president of Peru. He was a Japanese, he was a Peruvian born Japanese of immigrant parents in Peru. And at first, when I was reading, I thought that he was going to be really good because it seemed like he wanted, the reading said that he slashed tariffs, welcomed foreign investment, and that resumed some strong economic growth. But then when he became authoritarian, he was really against labor unions, and he a lot of people disliked his authoritarian tactics, especially as he was hurting the economy. But what was surprising to me was that peasants and women were his primary supporters. Now, after Fujimori's time in the later 20th century, Peru's economy grew again from coffee, sugar, and fruit. So that summarizes Peru. Now moving on to Colombia. Uh, After their independence from Spain, these Creoles they established their own junta, and then thereby removing the Spanish viceroy. there, which then led to Spain retaliating against Colombia. And then, in order to put up a strong front against Spain, Colombia united with Venezuela and Ecuador, forming what was called Grand Colombia, because they wanted to stand up to Spain and say like, "Hey, you're not going to control us." And this this did lead to some political unrest within the country, where Colombia and Venezuela created a centralist constitution in response to the Federalists of Patria Boba. Now, the reason it was only Colombia and Venezuela was because Ecuador was added a year later to Grand Colombia. And Simon Bolivar was part of the Grand Colombia experiment. In fact, he led it. And then northern or upper Peru wanted to be independent of Peru, of like the rest of Peru. So Simon Bolivar created the country Bolivia, kind of naming it after himself. Now, the main thing that made the Grand Colombia experiment fall apart was when Simon Bolivar died due to poor health. And kind of moving on to the economic side of Colombia, its main exports of the 20th century were coffee, which actually was huge because it led to the development of transportation networks like railroads or like paved roads. And then they also had perishable goods such as like bananas, tobacco, and other and then of course non-perishable goods like flowers and shoes and petroleum. They also had a huge part of their exports in the 20th century were illegal drugs, one of the big ones being cocaine. So, yeah, that will basically summarize Peru and Colombia. Kind of seems like coffee would have been the biggest export of those countries. So I hope I summarized this well. Thank you.